Welcome, welcome everybody to the Ed Wood Summit podcast. That's how our friend, the late Greg Javer, would have opened up this forum that he created, which was an offshoot of a blog to
Hold
which
on.
he contributed.
Yes.
And oh, there goes Joe with his technical difficulties. Um, but yes, Greg contributed to Joe's blog. I'll let him continue that when he gets back. And my name's Rob Huffman, and we've here reconvened the summit in Greg's memory. And today we're going to discuss a particular book that he thought might have been written by Ed Wood. But before we get into it, I just thought we'd go around and introduce ourselves. Joe, if you're back with this, I kind of name dropped you already, so maybe you want to talk about Ed
Yeah.
Wednesdays. And besides introducing yourself, and if you want to plug anything, maybe we could also share a memory of Greg. I thought that would be a nice gesture.
Well, uh, continuing this series was very important to me because Greg wrote for my blog. Greg wrote for my blog, Dead to Rights, and the series Ed Wood Wednesdays. He wrote a lot of articles for that. And when he started this Ed Wood Summit podcast series, I didn't quite know what to make of it. I didn't really know what he had in mind, and I didn't realize that at the time that this was going to become such a major project and such a great way of dealing with a lot of Ed Wood related media and issues. And so continuing the series was very important to me. And I was glad that we were able to convene a panel and find something worthy to talk about. Um, Today, just so viewers know, I may have to step away a couple of times because my door frame in my apartment is actually leaking water. I don't know how that's possible, but I will be here on the panel in spirit as I'm dealing with this door frame leakage issue. But yeah, the things that I have to plug, of course, are the blog Dead to Rights, d2rights.blogspot.com. I also have a podcast, These Days Are Ours, which you can find at thesedaysareours.libsyn.com. But if people want me, they can just look up my name and find a bunch of stuff.
This
So
will, of course, be hosted on your side, Dead to Rights, but just good to give context because it's going to be on YouTube too, and people might find it on YouTube. So that's great. Jim, you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, I'm Jim Ponzolillo. I'm the author of a couple of books on Ed Wood, and I would just say I really have to credit Greg's wonderfully friendly and outgoing nature for sort of
yeah,
pulling me out of the shadows
okay.
and into the public Ed Wood world. Otherwise, given my retiring nature, I probably would have just been this fly buzzing around in the background. But it was really Greg reaching out to me that got me much more active uh, in Ed Wood studies, as we like to call them.
Paul?
Hi, I'm Paul Apel. I've been on the Ed Wood Summit before. I'm kind of similar to Jim, except I reached out. I was a fan of Greg from reading Joe's blog, which I was also a fan of Joe. Um, and I was surprised he was so open to communication. And I would ask him every question that came to mind, and he knew everything, or seemed to know everything. And with with his help, we wrote this book, and so I guess that's my plug. And that never would have happened without his enthusiasm, and also Joe's blog, where the information originated in the first place. And so similarly, yeah, I was always an Ed Wood fan and always interested in this stuff, but I don't think I've ever really met anyone else to talk about it with, if not for him. So
One thing I remember is late nights when our women folk would fall asleep. Greg and I would correspond via email back and forth. And if it wasn't about Ed Wood, it was about our Sin and Sci-Fi project, where we never definitively found Wood, but it became an adventure in its own right. But as it would get late, and it was much later for him because he was, further out east, and his last email would always be a link to an obnoxious '80s song, and I'd fall for it every time. It was always the same song. I forget the name of the artist, but it was "We Don't Have to Take Our Clothes Off to Have a Good
Oh,
Time."
good. Oh, yeah.
So it was always like I fell for it again, and I don't know how many times I fell for it. It's just like if I just got a YouTube link, I should have just known this is what it's going to be. But anyway, that was always kind of like how we ended our correspondence that evening. That was pretty funny. So yeah, getting into the book today, Wild Nympho by Matt Ronson. Before we get into the text, I just wanted to mention that I looked for a Matt Ronson and I couldn't find another book by anyone by that name. But I thought it would be funny to mention that um, in a two comic books I found this name. One being Uncanny Tales. It was the name of a lighthouse caretaker who is glamored by sirens so that he'll turn off the lighthouse and a ship will crash and they can eat the people. I didn't I didn't read the whole comic. And the other was the Outlaw Kid, and the Outlaw Kid goes to visit someone by this name, and when he gets to his ranch, he's already dead. And I only mention these things because it's like when you're
Oh,
looking for what, is this a name Ed Wood used, and all you find are things of comic books about Western characters and weird horror tales. It just kind of is funny to me. It's like of all the things I found. The other thing I wanted to touch base on before we get into it is if someone might want to talk about Pad Library and GSN and Wood's involvement in those. I'll let someone take the baton.
well,
Oh,
actually, yeah, I was hoping you would because I think, I mean, this reads as Pad Library, but it has the Golden State News logo on the front cover. I was wondering if like you, I couldn't find anything by Matt Ronson. I kept finding things about the musician Mark Ronson that was cluttering up my Google results. I got sick of that guy. Um, so yeah, you were. What I was curious though, before as we get into the provenance of this book, was how did this book sort of even enter the chat? Really, how did this book become known to um, woodologists, and why did people start becoming interested in it? Was it one of Greg's discoveries, or was it one of your discoveries?
the earliest email I have about it is August 1st, 2021. And Greg writes, Wild Nympho from Pad Library / GSN is another one I'd bet a finger on. It's an expression he used a lot when he was very sure of something. I have two copies and Jim has one. And that was the first time I ever heard about it. And then several months before he passed, he doubled down on it and he's like, this is an Ed Wood book. I am confident. The reveal was something I was on the cusp of years ago, but never claimed. And at that time, he had 7 copies of the book, many of which we have. And Joe, I just noticed when you were flashing yours, we all have the same badge because they all have the same spray paint remainder mark.
Yeah, I think this book might have been released directly to the remainder bins. I think they might have just bypassed the normal book stalls and just released it right into the remainders. Um, so it was Greg who was. I know Greg. What Greg would do is just go through indexes of paperback books and magazines that were released. I think Golden State put out both books and magazines. Is that correct? Um, in the hopes of finding anything that could possibly be wood related. And maybe he zeroed in, he saw a title, and could the title of the book be more generic and sort of less descriptive of what's actually in the book? So, but could someone explain possibly, Rob, the power structure of Golden State News versus Pad Library?
That I don't know offhand. I know Bernie Bloom and Ed Wood both worked at Golden State News, and eventually they left to go to Pendulum. They were, I assume, I kind of make it up in my mind, they were lured by somebody help me with his name from Miami, um, the fellow who published Pendulum and opened up a West Coast operation, which Bernie Bloom and Ed Wood both.
Right.
I can't think of his name off the top of my
No,
head.
yeah.
But um, I know they left Golden State News where there were plenty of magazines and books. And I know uh, Ed Wood had a dozen or so titles on this, including Death of a Transvestite, the sequel to Black Lace Drag. Devil Girls was a pad. It Takes One to Know One. Uh,
Uh-huh.
Strange Sisters as Sherry Blue, I believe, is a reprint, if memory serves.
Don't
Uh,
know that one.
The Twilight Land is also a reprint of his first book, and then
Right.
the two Watts books were both pad. So we know he was we know he was there for several reasons. Besides, he has many other books. We know you can find his byline in the Golden State News magazines. So this is a very plausible publisher for him to have written another
Right.
book using uh, another a pseudonym because he's written so many books. That's not uncommon for people that are can so prolific that they need to start obscuring their prolificness with other names.
So was
Pendulum was Mike Thievis. That's who you're trying to.
well,
Thank you.
yeah, I was wondering if that's who you were referring
Yes,
to, if you meant Mike
America's Most
Thievis.
Wanted.
Yeah, because I thought you were going to lead with the thing of him being basically a gangster, basically. So when you were describing him in more mundane terms, I was like, he can't mean Michael Thievis because he would lead the FBI. He would lead with the FBI's most wanted list stuff, but he didn't. So I was like, oh, okay,
Yeah,
yeah, Mike
he was
Mike
a
Thievis.
legitimate businessman.
Well, yeah, you were describing him in such anodyne terms. I was like, he can't mean Mike Thiebaud. That's why I didn't volunteer that particular name. But so Golden State News is that the top, and then Pad Library is something underneath that. Is that's an imprint under GSN?
It's a good question. I know usually this little
Yeah, yeah.
means it's a distributor, right?
What you just said, Joe. Yeah, Golden State News and a company called SNC, which I can't remember what it stands for now. In '66, um, there was this constant shifting of ownership and distributor networks. And at some point in '66, Golden State News started distributing Imperial Books and Pad Library and others. Um, One of the biggest ones you'll see is on a lot of books, you'll see the initials LN. And that was a fairly mysterious distributor out of Long Island City, New York, that there's like no information on, although they had a huge network and hundreds of imprints that they controlled by the late 60s. Anyway.
Okay.
I think that's
So
on a lot of the epic books, LN, if memory serves.
And
does anybody
Ellen
know?
was notorious for plagiarizing.
Oh,
When you get their book, if you start, and I've encountered this on a number of occasions now, where I've now accumulated enough sleaze books of particular categories, right? Like carnival books that I'm working on, where I pick up one of an LN book and I'll start reading it, and I'm like, damn, this seems really familiar. And I start pulling my other books and I'm like, oh, it's a complete plagiarization of this book from 3 years earlier.
I see.
Anyway,
Yeah, I've
Does it?
heard the tip of always read the first sentence of the second chapter because sometimes they'd rewrite the first chapter thinking nobody would get beyond that or anyone's going through it. But anyway, that's a common thing that I've looked for. If I feel like,
Oh,
is this the same book as that one? Sometimes they aren't. They're just so similar, but
well, if
sometimes
you're reading the first sentence of the second chapter, try doing that in this book. See what you find.
yeah, that's a good point. This book is very weird in that it would be a publisher's nightmare. Let me find chapter 2. Is this? This is like the equivalent of dead air and radio and TV. That's
and then go to
money.
and then go to chapter 2, which is written as a numeral, whereas the other ones are all written in numbers. The first word of chapter 2 says, page of each was a 5-column photo. Yeah, you go to, well, that's the end of chapter 1, what you're showing, and then turn the page, then chapter 2 starts.
Yep. And it starts in the middle of a sentence.
So my guess was if it wasn't Ed Wood, E. E. Cummings might possibly have written this book. Uh, this has typos in it that I have never seen a book have, which is that the actual printed lines of text frequently are out of order so that you have to uh, jump up and down the page to sort of get through a paragraph. And my alternate title would have been the typesetter wore oven mitts, which is what I think was happening here. I think the person either typing this or doing the typesetting was possibly wearing thick mittens or oven mitts while doing this and was very clumsy and didn't have the sort of manual dexterity you needed for a project like this. So, yeah,
It's funny. This is not uncommon though in these books where a line is repeated twice, or like you said, they're just like they're confused. And yeah, is it a typesetter that's just like, nodding off in the job at 3 in the morning?
Sadly, Joe, it does not have a chapter surf teen like one of the other books.
right. Yes, I think that was that was like Mask of Evil or something,
Yeah,
something like that. But there are parts where the typos really get out of hand, where they're happening in every sentence.
yeah.
There are passages where it's more or less fine, but I'd never seen one quite. I haven't read as many of these books from this era, and I hadn't ever seen one as bad as Wild Nympho. So um,
Yeah,
I wonder.
they're particularly bad. And it's like sometimes I get some old OCR scanned books, that they've been reprinted, and they're full of errors because they've, changed an E to a C, that kind of thing. But yeah, it was a difficult read for that reason.
Well, and the thing is, Pad Library in general, when you look at their books, they don't fall into that lower category of some of the mob-controlled companies that were regularly putting out the kinds of typographical monstrosities we're talking about now. There's a definite subset of the sleaze literature, the very low end stuff, especially in the 70s. That's just, they're horror shows as far as the printing was concerned. Um,
I agree. I think some of the titles I mentioned, some of us have probably read most of them, are much easier. I think this one stands alone and being kind of a mess. And I do feel like it's a typesetter thing more than a author thing.
I appreciated it because it added a certain level of challenge to the book. It was like solving a little word puzzle every time you're trying to get through a page. So,
Yeah, it
um,
was like a choose your own adventure book almost.
yeah. So I was just very curious about the title. Um, and the cover has some very interesting text because it refers, I suppose, we haven't even gotten into the plot, but I suppose Jan Missouri is the wild nympho, which she's neither wild nor a nympho in the book, but she's the closest that I can see as being that character. And they refer to her as Cleo on the front cover, which she's only very, very briefly referred to as that in the book. So it's weird that that's
And
what they're
and
leading
deep
with.
into the book, right?
Yeah, it's weird that that's what they're leading with. So um, I suppose this sort of Dick Clark in season 1 of American Bandstand looking guy with the H.R. Haldeman haircut there. I think I guess that's supposed to be our Rick Force. What a great name, by the way. So, um, does somebody want to try to attempt summarizing the plot of Wild Nympho?
Well, I'd like to volunteer not to because it was so convoluted that I was in a panic thinking, how am I going to encapsulate this beyond the
Well,
bare minimum?
Well, it reminded me of that song. There was a spider. There once was a woman who swallowed a fly. I don't know why she swallowed a fly. Perhaps she'll die. And then other animals swallow this animal and then swallow this animal and swallow this animal. And
Mm.
so we're dealing with several layers of corruption and retaliation among various um, among various people in the syndicated crime world and the union world. Um, and I couldn't really understand the motivations of any of the characters by the end. And toward the end, there's some very exposition heavy chapters, where Rick goes back to Jan Missouri's home that she once shared with her husband, the late Jake Missouri, which why they called him that, because that sounds like something from a Western or something, totally wrong for the character. And Rick has gone there because he's figured out the whole plot. It's taken him all this time. I don't know how he's done it, but he's managed to piece all of this together from whatever he has. But I suppose we could start with the fact that one of the most interesting things about this book is that it is basically a story where instead of a detective or a cop at the center of it, we have a lawyer. Basically, it's basically sort of like a detective novel, but with the detective taken out and a lawyer put in. And it's no kind of lawyer like I've ever known. He basically lives his life like a private detective. He never goes to court. He never does anything remotely legal or anything like that. Basically, our hero is this fellow here. This is Rick Force.
Esquire.
Yeah, Rick Force, who I referred to, Penis Master, I guess that was is what's being implied there. He is basically an attorney with, I think, 3 clients who have him on retainer, all professional football players. Bronco, Hog, and Mule, I think was the third. And
I think he played ball too, right? They all
yes,
played ball together, and he represents them as
now he
professionals.
represents them. And basically, the plot kicks in because one of those 3, Bronco Zerski, who I assume is based on Bronco Nagurski, the actual football player from the 1930s. He has something that you see a lot in the old film noir films, which is a no good brother. He has what was his name? Albus or Albin? No,
Albin.
is
It's Albin.
Albin.
Yeah.
Albin, like Albin and the Chipmunks. He has a no good brother who has, for reasons unknown, basically assassinated very much in public a corrupt union leader named Jake Missouri, and then is immediately shot and killed himself. And now Bronco wants to know, why did Albin shoot Jake Missouri, and why was Albin then killed immediately? So he starts investigating basically the way a private detective would.
Can I jump in at this point?
Please do.
Oddly enough, the book somehow models the killing of New York mafia leader Joe Colombo in the early 70s, who was also gunned down by this nobody
Yeah.
who was immediately killed by police on the scene.
So this book actually predicted that.
Yeah, in a weird way, right? In a thematic, it's very strange.
Well,
When I read the book, I was like, yeah, I know.
well,
I'm not trying to read too much into this, right? But oddly enough, it does. It has the plot line of what happened to Joe Colombo.
well, to understand where this book was coming from, I believe this book came out in 1966. You have to understand what was going on in the news at that time, because it's very heavily referencing things that were happening in the 1960s. Basically, there was a very powerful union leader named Jimmy Hoffa,
Right.
who was intimately tied in with organized crime. He was basically nominally a union leader, but was basically a gangster. And in this book, Jake Missouri has had a lot of battles with I think they call him a district attorney. And they talk about, and the narrator describes him as being roasted to a sizzling red in front of like a Senate subcommittee, and basically this is all referencing these big Senate hearings where Jimmy Hoffa would be dragged in front of Congress to answer a lot of questions. And the person questioning him and who was his main sort of enemy in life was RFK Sr. So the RFK Jimmy Hoffa saga, it would have been very fresh in people's minds, and is being played out here in this book sort of fictionally. They've sort of changed the characters' names, but they're referencing all of that in this book. I didn't, when I went looking for a documentary about all this stuff, the first one I found was actually made by WDIV, which is a TV station in Detroit. And it was the TV station that it would have been the NBC affiliate that I watched growing up. So I was embarrassed to say I did not know as much of the history of Jimmy Hoffa as I probably should have, because a lot of it did happen in this novel. I believe all happens in New York, but in real life, I guess a lot of this actually happened in Detroit. But basically, yeah, we have this lawyer who takes this case and then travels around. He goes to this ranch. Well, then the other thing we should mention is that very quickly in the investigation, Bronco himself is killed. It's one of those things where he starts up his car and then it blows up. And Rick Force happens to be just far enough away from the explosion so that he is only slightly hurt. And this kind of stuff happens to Rick all the time in the book. People around him are getting blown up and killed. And at first, I thought that the car blowing up and Bronco being killed that way was way over the top, was totally ridiculous. But then as I was watching this documentary about Jimmy Hoffa, there would be warring factions within the labor unions and who were fighting for control. And blowing people up in their cars was not unheard of.
Mhm.
So planting car bombs was actually a thing that really did happen. And I don't know if people saw I haven't seen this film. It's called The Irishman. It was directed by Martin Scorsese. It's basically a very fictionalized version of some of these events. So, yeah. So, yeah, basically, Rick Forst kind of travels around. He goes to this ranch. There's a whole part where Bronco owned a ranch in Dry Bed, Arizona, and Albin's widow, Reba, still lives there with a very surly ranch hand named Luke. And then that's a whole part of the book. And then basically the thing that you have to know about Rick is that wherever he goes, women act exactly like you'd want them to if you were a detective in this kind of story, because basically all women just fall for Rick kind of immediately, and most of them end up having sex with him within hours, if not minutes. And like all good private detectives, he has a secretary, Tony, and he and Tony have a sexual relationship, and then Tony is
T-O-N-I,
killed. Go ahead.
I just want to say Tony spelled with an I, Tony, which is
Yeah.
a name used by Wood numerous times.
Yeah, Ed loved those names that had male and female cognates. Um, the other really woody things in the book, um, I might not have immediately noticed this as an Ed Wood book, but once you get into it, I think the most woody things in the book are the fact that Jake Missouri's widow, Jan Missouri, has a past as has a shameful past as a carnival worker who entertained with snakes, but she also did a little bit of pornography on the side, and she's maybe possibly being blackmailed for that. That seems like something that Ed would have had. Um, it's a little bit similar to a story in Shotgun Wedding, where there's a character who has sort of a shameful carnival past that she's hiding. Ed, of course, loved carnivals. And the fact that this lady's act involves snakes, snakes are a big motif in Ed's work. And I don't know about anyone else, but as soon as I found out that Jan Missouri had these deadly snakes, and she said, they won't hurt me because I can control them. I saw, I saw her fate coming from 8 million miles away because it's a rule in movies that if a villain has deadly animals that they sick on people, sort of as attack animals, which she does use her snakes that way, that they will eventually turn on their master or mistress. You can see that in like Gary Oldman's character in Hannibal, or uh, Peter Lawford in Angel's Revenge, and Bela Lugosi in Bride of the Monster. Basically, if you have a deadly animal that you're using on people as sort of your attack animal, that animal will eventually turn on you. So,
Yeah,
Lugosi and the Devil Bat. Oh, I'm sorry.
There's a number of carnival sleaze novels that, with snakes, have this very same fate in store for the villain. Yeah, and it's usually a woman. It's actually all the cases I can think of off the top of my head. It's a woman who her own pets turn on her.
so yeah, so I was not terribly surprised by what happens to her. One thing I thought that was weird about her life and her world was that she and Jake Missouri were like living the high life because of all the money they were skimming, I guess, off of the labor unions. And one of the status symbols they have is a J-shaped swimming pool, which stands for Jan and Jake. But I just kept thinking in the book how inconvenient a J-shaped swimming pool would actually be. Like, oh my God, like you'd be constantly hitting your head on like the curves and all this kind of stuff. So, um, no, just give me a rectangle shaped swimming pool. Having a J-shaped swimming pool uh, it might look cool from satellite photos, but other than that, I don't see the advantage of it. Um, I don't know if any of you were looking for Ed Wood turns of phrase, but when she was talking about her um, her past and the shameful photos that she may have posed with, the adjective she uses is conventional. These photos were not so conventional, and Ed loves to use conventional in terms of sexuality and what is considered appropriate or not. And toward the end, when Jan Missouri and Rick Force are having their last big showdown, uh, she even says, "Take it out in trade." So that was a definite Ed Wood phrase. Um, but
The onset of this book, I wanted to try to read it just being like, I'm just going to read this book and let things come to me, but I'm not going to make any assumptions. And some things immediately, just as someone who's read a lot of Ed Wood, just, flags start going off. There were lots of words and phrases in all caps, and some of them were
Yeah.
periodicals, and that's not uncommon to do that. But there were just words that were emphasized. But there were also like single line paragraphs that emphasized something, and that something would do a lot. Like you'd have a paragraph and then a one sentence paragraph. So when I first started reading the first chapter, I was just like, lawyers, football, New York. But then those little, grammatical and syntax things started to stand out to me.
Now, I won't provide I won't provide an opinion on this, but I know,
Oh,
one of the things that Greg pointed out to me that he thought was indicative of Ed in the book was some of the repetition you see. And I've got a few examples. So it's things like, make me feel it, make me feel it.
okay.
And so I made her feel it. More, I want you to do more. And so I did
Did
more. Please don't stop. And so I didn't stop. Give it to me. And so so I gave it to her. That was one of the things that, he felt was,
Yeah, I was going to say Matt Ronson must have really, whoever Matt Ronson was, must have really thought that that was a great trick in writing because he sets up that way of like, you know, she said, give it to me, so I gave it to her. She said, give me more, so I gave her more. He must have really thought he had hit on something fantastic when he wrote that passage because I think there's certainly a second one, and there might be a third. I don't know if he goes through that whole sequence like 3 times.
Mhm.
Um, it almost was like I started reading Grimm's fairy tales, and basically in Grimm's fairy tales, they will have certain sequences that play out, and then the same basic thing happens a second time, and then the same basic thing happens a third time, and they use a lot of the same phrases over and over again, you know. So, um, yeah, I thought whoever the author of was of this must have really been enamored of that construction of those passages because I know for a fact that it occurs at least twice, but I want to say that there are at least 3 passages of that throughout the book. Would you say?
I wouldn't be
Yeah.
surprised. Definitely twice, but I could see it. I could see it being a third time.
Well,
And
go ahead.
oh, no, just finish your thought, Joe.
Well, no, I was gonna ask, and I don't know if anybody would be comfortable doing this. Was now Greg would have bet his finger. Did you say that
Right.
this was an Ed Wood novel? Is everyone here on the panel 100% convinced that this was Ed? I was just curious.
Well,
I would say rather the opposite, and I could talk about that later, but
I was going to say the opposite as well, um, because I thought there are certain words and phrases and constructions that Ed probably would not have used. But the other thing that I could say was that this was 1966. This is before his paperback writing career is really what we know it to become. You know, the real hot and heavy period of his career is like 68 to like 72 or 73. And I thought my only explanation for that was that maybe in 1966 he had not hit upon his signature writing style. But what I really thought was indicative of this not being Ed was I didn't see any of Ed's what I call his two-worders or his three-worders, like the whole sex routine or this whole gun affair or something. He likes to throw those two-worders and three-worders in there. And I didn't really see that throughout this book. And a lot of his trademark words like lovely, I was surprised, like there's no lovelies, I don't think, in this book, which would have been very unusual for Ed to not use that phrase. So um, I don't know, Paul, what did you
Yes.
think? Did you think that this, would you bet your life on this being an Ed Wood book?
Well, I would not bet my life on it. I mean, it's like half and half, almost literally. It's this thing where I started reading it and I got about halfway through and I thought, I don't know how anyone would think. I mean, respect to Greg, of course. He knows a lot more than I do. But I was about halfway through thinking like I don't really see anything, and especially the two biggest sex scenes are like in the first few chapters, and then it kind of isn't really even a sex novel and until like really brief passages later on.
Right.
But the two big ones at the beginning, like neither of them went into the detail of the women's clothing or anything. And I thought that was not very Ed Wood like. He wasn't describing textures or what they were
Right.
taking on or putting on or taking off. But, so that stuff, I was like, that on top of it being like a New York setting and it being about football, even though, I mean, the book Greg and I worked on was about football and the we were like, we can't believe he wrote a screenplay about a football coach. So reading this, then I was like, well, I don't know if this is Ed. Maybe football was more of a thing. I don't know. But also at the same time, I was like, that seems really strange setting it in the world of sports. I mean, even though it has basically no bearing on the book whatsoever. But so all that kind of stuff for the first half, I was like, I don't know. Then all of a sudden, about halfway through, little things started popping up, and you mentioned some of them, like when the snakes come up, and she specifically says, or someone says, sliding, slithering things, and it reminded me of the mummy from Orgy of the Dead. He doesn't. I don't think he specifically says sliding, slithering, but slimy, slippery things or something like that.
Yeah, he says
Um,
something like that.
uh, so that jumped out at me, and then shortly after that, Hogg is calling someone Pappy, and Ed Wood, according to Bernie Bloom, Ed Wood called Bernie Pappy all the time, and I think he even called Apostolov Pappy, but I might be getting them confused. Um, Not that that's necessarily something only one person would do, but that jumped
Right.
out at me. Then he said he was in a muddle at one point, which made me think
Yes.
of Glenn or Glenda. And in the pool, in the J-shaped pool, at the climax of the book, they sink underwater together, and they're down there a really long time, and it talks about the sensation of holding your breath underwater until it feels like you're going to explode, and then he comes back up out of the water, and she comes back up out of the water, and she makes some kind of comment about how awesome. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but like how impressive it was he could stay underwater so long or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
And I was thinking that's a thing that came up in a couple interviews in Nightmare of Ecstasy where Ed was, part of his war tales was about, staying underwater a really long time, and that he would do that in the pool and impress people with how long he could hold his breath underwater. So kind of like the snake motif, it just seemed like something Ed was already fixated on holding his breath underwater. Uh, but so yeah, all that stuff. All of a sudden, about halfway through, that stuff started popping up in quick succession, and so then I was like, well, maybe it is. And I went back and I read a chat between Greg and I where I was asking him why he thought this is before I ever read it, but he had mentioned it to me, and I was asking him why he thought it was Wood. And he mentioned the first thing he mentioned was there's a description of an old Western star and his trick shooting.
Oh, yeah, there is. Yes, there is a trick shooting reference that is very much like the Kenny Duncan film.
Yeah. So there was that. And then he cited lots of snakes. And then, um, I mean, that was about all he said to me. But he said he read it once and wasn't sure, and then read it again and was sure. And I was reading it to the point where I was wondering, is it a possibility someone wrote the first half of the book and then someone else finished the second half of the book?
It could be.
I don't,
Yeah. At first, I don't think, yeah, so the first entire half of the book, basically, I wasn't really finding the cadence of Ed's writing at all. And so, again, I was trying to justify it as being maybe Ed hadn't hit on his signature style yet, but the Woodisms really start, um, yeah, the potential Woodisms start coming in about midway through the book. So that is an explanation. And I would also say I wouldn't find it very likely that Ed would write this story about a lawyer whose only clients were football players. That really doesn't seem um, like him. But the question then would be is if Matt Ronson isn't Ed Wood, who could he be? Who would have written this? Who could have written this thing?
Well,
Uh,
just to throw in a couple of thoughts, I earlier flashed this book on the screen
oh my
just
gosh.
just because, we so associate the phrase "take it out and trade" with Ed. And this was a book from 1957 by someone called, Walter Whitney. This is an Ace book. Unfortunately, Ace's records from this time period no longer exist. To this day, no one knows who Walter Whitney is. It's thought to have been a pseudonym. But I bring this book up because when this came out in 1957, its subtitle is "She Offered Excitement on the Installment Plan." It caused such a scandal, including congressional hearings, that it became well known. So, like I said, I bring this up as an example of something that, we think of that phrase, "take it out in trade," as being Woodian almost, but it might have been something that Ed and others happened onto just because of the publicity that this book got, the negative publicity that this got earlier. So I just happened to, one of the few books I have sitting here in the midst of my move. But, sorry, Paul, you want to jump in?
Well, I was just going to say, speaking of take it out and trade, that does remind me of one thing I forgot to mention, which is at the very Take It Out and Trade, the movie by Ed Wood, is just one long joke leading up to the punchline of "take it out and trade," right? And this book, it's one long series of sequences and stuff, ending with the punchline of a main motivator of him looking into all this stuff is that his sex partner, secretary Tony, is murdered. And then in the last 2 pages or something, it turns out Tony has a twin sister, and she shows up to be his new secretary. So everything's back to normal now because he has a facsimile of Tony.
And it has him wondering, hey, I wonder if her clothes come off after a couple of drinks, like her sister. And so, well, let's find out. He gives her a drink to start the progression.
I had a very similar experience. I'm sorry, you can finish up your point, Paul.
Just the concept of ending on a little twist/joke at the last second like that reminded me of Take It Out and Trade. But anyway,
I just wanted to note I had a similar experience to Paul in that I actually read this in 2 halves. So I read the first half and then I put it down for a while. And my initial reaction was the location. And it's funny because Bob Blackburn once mentioned to me that you don't see almost any locations mentioned ever in Ed Wood's short fiction, except LA occasionally. In his novels, like Security Risk, there's LA, and then, they travel across the state. But often just the locations they're vague. But this is very, very specific about New York.
Yeah.
And that seemed very not like Wood. I also, like Paul, found that there wasn't much written about female attire. I think I only found like one sentence about green silk, but it wasn't fetishized. It was just So I found that an issue. Also, in the first half of the book, there wasn't much alcohol, and usually there's tons of alcohol in a Wood book. Like it's just like, oh, they have 3 drinks before they even, sit down on the divan.
That was another big thing that had me wonder. I mean, obviously, if someone's writing this quickly, they can maybe forget what they did or said. But at the very beginning, he specifically says he doesn't drink, or at least says he doesn't drink that much. And then about halfway through, he just starts knocking them back and I don't even think it mentions like, this is out of the ordinary for me, but I guess I'll drink now. He just like starts drinking like you would expect him to. So it's interesting.
The classic Ed Wood geographic reference to me is in reference to something like in Black Lace Drag. The book starts off and he says the character is 1,000 miles east of Lamar, Colorado. Which, if you take a look at a map, is okay. So he's telling us he's somewhere in Indiana or possibly Ohio, in like Western Indiana or Western Ohio. And it's the win, and he also says that it's winter time, so you know it can't be 1,000 miles to the southeast, like down in Georgia or something. You know, that's the kind of inferential sort of geography that Ed likes to give. I've seen in novels. Um, you know, being being an anal scientist my whole life, of course, I had to subject this book to these keyword
Okay.
analyses I like to do. And this is what sort of, well, let me just tell you what the results are before giving a conclusion, right? So
Jim, in my imagination, this is a machine you've built, just so you know.
Yes,
yeah, the machine is my faulty brain.
with big reel-to-reel tape decks, those big reel-to-reels
Yeah.
on it, and
And
the
he feeds
flashing
it punch
lights.
cards.
And
And
maybe
you
there's
just
a
feed the
Tesla
book into
coil
it.
or something going zzz, zzz, anyway. So after a lot of iterations, and Joe informed some of this and Greg informed some of this, I had settled on this group of 51 quote keywords, and there's a subset of 12 that are really frequent, like they occur in between 92 and 100% of the time in what Ed writes. And I'm talking now, I used for this basis a group of 28 novels that he wrote. And I say specifically novels because it's not including things like movie treatments he did, like Orgy of the Dead. I focused on novels specifically as long form items where he didn't have any limitations. It was just he was channeling out of himself, right? It wasn't like, oh, I've got this group of photos like Raped in the Grass that I need to write a plot around, you know? So anyway, in this group of 28 novels, shockingly, the word Angora is used 100% of the time. There isn't a single one of those novels that does not have the word Angora in it. From a low of 1 citation in Tony Black Tigress all the way to a high of 38 in TV Lust, with the average being 13 across all 28 novels, 13 instances on average. Of course, Ronson doesn't use it once, right? So to my mind, now, would I ever rule out a book for not having the word Angora in it? No, I wouldn't, right? Because we don't know the totality of novels that Ed wrote. All we can say now is that of this group of 28, they all have Angora, but we can't say that perhaps he didn't write a few that didn't have it. But it is sort of a strike that it doesn't have it. In the group of keywords overall, this group of 51 words, when you look at Ed's novels, Sideshow Siren was the low at using 75% of those words. And Gay Underworld was the high at like 91%. Ronson comes in at 26. So he's like
Yeah.
half again off the bottom end. And then, later in time, I came up with this metric that I like to call woodiness, where it actually prorates the usage of these words compared to how frequently Ed used them, to try to give a better feel for how wood-like the text is. And those numbers, again, Sideshow Siren comes in at a low of like 2754, and the high point is TV Lust at 5493. Ronson is 325. So all those things sort of added together, reinforced my feeling that while there are these little glimmers you can see of the text of things that would say, oh, that sounds sort of like Ed, and that sounds sort of like Ed. These other measures, really undermined any feel that gave in my mind. Then the last thing I would say is that, this book is quite tame. This would be a quite tame
Yeah.
Ed Wood book, because already by 1963, when he wrote Black Lace Drag, if you look at some of the themes in that, there's aside from homosexuality and lesbianism, he's covering attempted rapes, masturbation, pedophilia, of course, the clothing and sexual fetishes. And my favorite part is, uh, at least among carnival novels, Ed is the first one to bring urination and water sports to public view when the protagonist gets angered at this farmer that tries to assault him. So of course he knocks him out and leaves the farmer out cold on the ground, and as a final insult, urinates on his panties and leaves them spread over the passed out farmer's face for when he wakes up. Um, so Wild Nympho actually, I think sometimes people forget actually some of the content in Ed's, even in his very early novels. He was actually quite ahead of where a lot of other writers were as far as pushing transgressive content early.
I would agree that this would be a very tame and rather disciplined novel by Ed's sense. One feeling that I had even toward the end of the book, we go to some important action later in the book happens at a club called the Wild Boar, I believe, and there is kind of an interminable build up to how he figures out that the name of the place is the Wild Boar, because a character who is dying says something that sounds like wild boar in French, and it feels like pages and pages and pages to eventually figure out this stupid riddle. I don't know why the person dying because I guess the person dying was French or something. But the first time they describe this place, it's in Brooklyn, but they describe it as being across the river from the former home of those bums. Now, the bums are what would have been the Brooklyn Dodgers.
Right.
And Brooklyn felt betrayed when the Dodgers moved from Brooklyn to Los Angeles, but they would have called them the bums anyway. And the fact that we don't even say Brooklyn at first, we eventually do say Brooklyn, but we start with the bums, the former home of those bums. And we're supposed to know, oh, he's referring to the former Brooklyn Dodgers. That strikes me as something that Ed would never have done in a million years. He wouldn't have given a damn about the Brooklyn Dodgers. He certainly wouldn't have used that to denote this as being Brooklyn. So
that makes me think the person that wrote this was from New York. Besides all the locations, that would be something if you were a fan and you were in New York and they left, you would be angry about.
Well, and the book even discusses like the plight of the New York Mets at that time, which is something that I cannot imagine could have been on, would have been on Ed's radar enough to have made it into a.
No. But one thing I will say, that even though I didn't find the book particularly woody, I did find the book entertaining, and I actually had a lot of fun reading this book. I would read it actually on my lunch breaks at work, and it was quite risky taking in a book called Wild Nympho into an office building every day and just sort of hiding it under my arm here as I would go to read it in like the break room or something. But no one ever asked. But I have to imagine that Wild Nympho was a title that the publisher chose and the publisher put on there, because there are no wild nymphos in the book at all that I could find. And certainly, even though I suppose this lady here is supposed to be Jan Missouri. Certainly she makes some questionable moral decisions along the way in this book, but to describe her as a wild nympho seems quite unfair. Certainly she is strategic, in fact, in choosing her sex partners. Um, she is sort of sexually playing both sides of the field here, but she does this very, very strategically. Like one of her husband's labor union enemies is one of her lovers. And then Rick Force is one of her lovers, but she's doing this always for reasons. She's very strategic in that. So the very opposite of a nympho who would be just, um, who would just be making love indiscriminately to just anybody who comes along. But I can't think of another person in the book to whom the title Wild Nympho would actually apply.
So it's funny you mentioned that because when I got about halfway through and there weren't any wild nymphos, I was like, what are they talking about? I mean, is it a total misnomer or have I just not gotten there yet? And the only thing I could think of is in quick succession within the first couple of chapters, Rick Force himself sleeps with two different women.
Okay.
So then I thought maybe Rick Force is the wild nympho.
Okay. I wanted him to be the Wild Nympho, but I'm also a fan of the movie The Big Lebowski. And in that, there is a discussion of nymphomania and its male counterpart, satyriasis. There are those, we're told that one female character is a nymphomaniac, and Julianne Moore says that it's called satyriasis in males. So,
Yeah, and not only that, I mean, a book of this, of course, they would never refer to a male sex drive as being out of control or anything. So I knew it wasn't Rick because it's supposed, like James Bond
well,
wouldn't be,
he's the most promiscuous person in the whole novel.
Right.
Okay, I'll tell you, there's one more sort of Woodian touch that I would like to mention is that a place where he goes to maybe meet up with a hot date is a club called the Ding Dong Club. And then that's written, I believe, in all caps every single time. Ding Dong Club is something that I think, even if Ed didn't write this, that Ed would have appreciated because Ed liked to give things silly names like that. But I mean, he would use ding dong he would use that as a sexual euphemism to refer to a body part, like she latched onto his ding dong, I mean, that would be something that Ed would put into a sex scene that would kind of ruin the mood, but Ed would put it in there anyway, because I think those kinds of words and phrases he found funny.
Yeah.
And so, but yeah, if anybody in this book deserves to be called a nympho, it's actually H.R. Haldeman there up in the corner. Or maybe he also sort of looks like Carson Daly a little bit. He looks a little bit like Carson Daly, sort of a 90s Carson Daly.
Well, Rick's living the dream in that era where, on the one hand, as he does, right, the men are supposed to be attempting to bed everything down in mere moments. But of course, the women who give in to those blandishments too much are quite diseased individuals, which raises that dichotomy of, well, that doesn't actually work in practice. But as far as the covers go, 19 there were Supreme Court rulings in 1968 that blew open publishing. And that's when we get this like flood of basically pornographic stuff after that into the 70s. And before then, right, this is not uncommon that you've got these covers that just patently trick the reader about what the contents actually are and make it seem much naughtier and spicier than what you're actually going to encounter in the book. Oftentimes the covers portray completely different circumstances than are actually in the book. It's like, oh, this is about a gangland something. It's like, well, no, there's none of that in there. It's actually this boring melodrama that takes place in a small town. And it's only really after 68 that you get truth in advertising, where you start getting things like Hot Amorous Mom and as the title, and that this is going to be about incest, right?
Well, I would say that one thing in the defense of Wild Nympho is that if you pay the 95 cents, which I think would translate to about $10 in today's money, I think prices since the 60s have gone up about 10 times. So um, I don't think you would have been ripped off if you had paid your 95 cents for this. I think it would have given you pretty much what you wanted or felt you could get out of a book like this. So there is certainly plenty of violence. Um, there's, I would say, an adequate amount of sex in it. It's not allowed to be too terribly explicit. I think the only body parts that they can really specify are breasts. Um, I don't know how specific they can be in the anatomy. I don't think it gets any more graphic than that. So a lot of it is implied. But I can imagine, a guy picking up this at a book stand, and I think he would have gotten his 95 cents worth out of this book. I don't think he would have felt ripped off. And the scene that we see depicted on the cover is, I don't think, inaccurate. It's showing Rick getting dressed because he's always working, basically, in this book. Even when he's having sex, he's so important and so busy that people are paging him while he's having sex with ladies like this all the time. That's the life of a lawyer in New York, I'm telling you, Um, even when you're betting pretty ladies, your phone's blowing up constantly. I was just thinking what a different novel this would have been in a world of cell phones. But because I think in this book he has to have calls wherever he goes, he has to have his calls forwarded to him. And there's a thing about an answering service. And I was thinking, oh boy, all this technology, answering services and call forwarding and all of that has gone away. But it shows him getting dressed. Well, a very satisfied lady lounges in bed. And I would say that that is pretty typical of several sequences in this book. So, yeah, I would say that I think it delivers. I think it would say it delivers on the promise of this cover. Um, do you think that this could have been made into a film? Does anybody think this could have been made into a film? What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that
With
you
Dean
know,
Martin.
Dean Martin.
yeah, it's a fairly straightforward. I mean, it's basically seemingly patterned after like a Philip Marlowe type
Right.
story. Like you mentioned the Big Lebowski earlier, but that's kind of like a weird like stoner version of like The Long Goodbye. And
Right.
though this gets so convoluted, like those books that yeah.
Well, yeah. Have you heard the story that I did about making uh, The Big Sleep into a movie? And the screenwriter of The Big Sleep, I think that's based on is that like Raymond Chandler or something, a novel.
Yeah.
And basically, the screenwriter contacted the novelist about some particular plot point and said,
Mhm.
how about this? And the the novelist hadn't actually figured it out either. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure that the plot of this thing, if you went back knowing the solution, um, would 100% make sense. I don't think that the plot of this thing is airtight. I'm sorry to say, I don't know that the plot of this is airtight. Um, but it has that kind of dream logic to it. And in fact, it has something that the Coen brothers put into The Big Lebowski because it's a detective story staple or a film noir staple, which is that at one point the hero goes unconscious and then wakes up. And I believe that happens to Rick, I think twice in this book, where there's situations where he winds up unconscious and then he comes to. Um, although there is one situation where he goes to an extremely sketchy neighborhood, an extremely sketchy apartment, and he's left his gun on the dresser drawer at home or something. And I'm like, come on. Uh, how did Rick survive all of these adventures that he's had in the book? Um, you
Yeah,
know,
what kind of sports lawyer leaves their gun at home when they
Well, that's the difference between being a lawyer, was if he was a detective that, or, a private eye, that wouldn't have happened. Um,
And he
One
seemed more
final
like a
little note that
sports
I should have
agent, you
should have
know?
said at the
Yeah,
beginning
yeah.
for completion is, of course, there is no Library of Congress catalog of copyright entry for this book. Just
oh,
in case anyone was wondering, and that they don't run off looking and waste their time. That was something that, Greg and I had looked into right off the bat, just to make sure before we started diving into it, that there wasn't. So there isn't any entry, and there aren't any entries findable for a Matt Ronson in that time period. So in the copyrights. So
so does that mean members of Congress could not actually check out a copy of this book if they needed to?
um
I always pictured
the Library of Congress has very few books of this ilk,
I always
as
pictured
I'm
the
sure they
library
would say.
I always pictured the Library of Congress as being an actual library that congressmen could go to. I'm not sure to what extent
Well,
it
yeah,
is.
they would send they could certainly send their staffers there to have books pulled for them. And
So,
the Library of Congress's collections are missing lots of books that were
oh,
never returned. And so when you see something in their catalog, don't don't assume that it
that they
still
have it.
exists. I did enough work down there
Well,
to run into that problem.
well, certainly part of the inspiration for this book were real life congressional hearings in which union leaders were questioned about their mafia connections. And I would say that Matt Ronson, whoever he was vehemently anti-union. So I think this is kind of an anti-union book. It's really tough for me to comment on that because I'm from Flint, Michigan, which is an automobile manufacturing town. My grandfather was actually one of the first sit-down strikers. He was one of the original sit-down strikers at General Motors. Um, and workers really were being oppressed and taken advantage of and abused by employers before the unions came along. So big business was very culpable, but then the unions themselves became quite corrupt. Um, and Jimmy Hoffa was kind of represented the worst of that. So um, Jake Missouri is, you know, Jake Missouri is not really an exaggeration of Jimmy Hoffa. It's actually pretty accurate to what he would have been, and all the warring between factions in the unions was very real. So perhaps Matt Ronson was anti-union. Just said he was vehemently anti-union. And in fact, when I said that during the congressional hearings, he was in the book, they say he was roasted to a sizzling red. And I had to wonder if that was basically, he was using red as a, unions are for commies, basically. Although Jake Missouri is certainly a capitalist guy. He's not living a communist lifestyle at all. He's certainly living it up very big. But uh, Jimmy Hoffa was a horrible man, but uh, he was basically taking advantage of. Well, he was, fighting, but he was fighting for workers at the same time he was making big profits for himself and committing all kinds of crime. Um, But the more you get into the story, the more depressing it gets. Basically, big business was very corrupt, and then the unions took on big business. They became very corrupt. The feds started fighting the unions. The feds, in their own way, were very corrupt. Um, Jimmy Hoffa became sort of very cozy with Richard Nixon, and Richard Nixon arranged for him to get out of prison. And then that turned out great for Jimmy Hoffa, because a few years later, we all know what happened to, or we don't know what happened to Jimmy Hoffa. So I think at the time this book was written, it was just assumed that somebody was eventually going to rub out a big union leader like Jimmy Hoffa. So the plot of this is actually surprisingly not all that far-fetched. I'll ask one more thing. There was one scene that I found actually genuinely amusing, and it was when Rick Force accompanies the two surviving football players to a TV commercial shoot for breakfast cereal. Did anybody else find that particular scene funny? I found it funny because
Yeah, I thought that was funny. It actually kind of reminded me, speaking of like predicting things, it reminded me of in one of the like Rocky 2 or something
Rocky 2 is what it
yeah,
reminded me of. That was
yeah,
it was like it reminded me so much of the scene in Rocky 2 where Rocky is trying. I forgot what Rocky is supposed to be doing a commercial for, but it's very similar to that. But I assume that actually happens to real athletes all the time when they're
yeah.
brought on to commercials. They're not actors. Um, so yeah, I found that kind of amusing. I don't know if
Yeah,
go
I
ahead,
was
Jim.
going to say, when you were talking about Jake Missouri's lifestyle, right? This brings up like the kinds of details that we don't see Ed writing. In Wild Nympho, while they don't name where Jake lives, they provide enough information. They say it's a tall apartment building on Riverside Drive, just north of 72nd Street. There's only one building that fits that bill. There's a 19-story Art Deco building that was put up in 1937 that's at 5 Riverside Drive nowadays. And so, this is someone who knew Manhattan well, right? To know the existence of that building and then give a slightly elliptical reference to it. And that's just not the kind of thing you see. And that's one example. There's a number of examples, if you go through Wild Nympho, where you can figure out what exact place the author's referring to, even though
Yeah.
he's not quite saying it.
That was
So
the biggest argument I have for this not being Wood are those specifics, because there are books written by Englishmen, hard-boiled crime set in New York City, and all they had was a map and a book of American lingo, and you can tell that they don't know what they're talking about. But this is someone that had been there, and obviously, we know Wood could have visited New York, being from Poughkeepsie, and in your books, Jim, he might, but it's just like this is with the calling the Dodgers bums. This is a New Yorker that wrote this book.
yeah.
But that second half, when I picked up the second half, all those things that Paul mentioned, those kind of started making me want. And it's like, could he have finished it? I don't know, possibly. I think I don't think there's enough there, but there were all these nuggets. Like in the first half, I was
Yeah.
mining for things. Like I'd be like, oh, there's a morgue and there's a lot of blood and things like that, and Tony. But later, just all these phrases popped out, and they could be, some of them are common parlance we know Wood uses, like rat race showed up, and it made me go, oh,
Yeah.
things like that. The muddle and Pappy. Then I started to go like, oh, it made me rethink what I had read in the first half of the book. And the snakes and the sharpshooter, it made me second guess it. But overall, I don't. There's not enough references to. Although there's more drinking in the second half than there is in the first.
Yeah.
Um, there's no the fetishism of women's clothing, and on these specific locations in New York, those were things that really stood out as something that wouldn't have written, or would he would have included those things in his novel, and they're omitted from this one.
I will say that, I can't say that Ed Wood wrote this book. I think this book would appeal to people who like Wood's writing. If you have read some of Wood's novels and you enjoy them, Wild Nympho will be entertaining to you. It is a good companion. Basically, when you read a novel, I always think of the novel as becoming sort of my companion while I read it. and Wild Nympho is an entertaining companion. So I would not discourage people from reading it if they can get themselves a copy. And just as an object, look at that cover. Isn't that beautiful? So I'm glad I have this copy of. I'm glad I had this copy of Wild Nympho. How many copies did Greg have?
7 in the end.
Yeah.
Why did he have
I-
7 copies?
Because he was like, this is Wood, and I'm taking them all off the market.
That's not the only book he did that with. There were a couple of books he clued me in on, and like at the time he clued me in on them. I was always I never bought more than one copy of a book that I thought might be by Ed. I figured I'll leave the others for other folks if they can get their hands on them, right? But Greg would get very enthusiastic and buy multiple copies and then sometimes give them away. For anyone who's listening to this right now, there is a copy of Wild Nympho on eBay for $22 and $5 shipping. So if you want to if you want to let your gray matter luxuriate in this 1965 novel, there is that's I've been buying sleaze novels for too long, so to me, $22 is like chump change.
Yeah,
right.
Other people might find that pricey, but it's not for something of this vintage and rarity.
Yeah, and Greg actually, when he was telling me that he thought it was Ed Wood, I looked it up real quick and said, "Oh, there's one for $20 right now," and he was like, "Don't buy it. I will send you one." And so I think now, if I'm not mistaken, Rob, right, you sent me one of his, right? So this
That's
is one
right.
of the 7. Okay.
Yeah.
So
this
yes, I
must be one
eventually-
of them too. This must have been one of them as well, because I didn't buy this. This was sent to me.
Yeah.
I'll have to look at my copy when I get to it again to see if it has the paint mark on it. If I got the same lot out of the same lot that Greg did.
I want to read
I wanted to.
that I think would have been something that made Greg think this was Ed Wood, because it was wording that he had grabbed onto in other novels. Like, he would have thought this was something Ed Wood wrote. Like the meeting of 2 high voltage cables, fizzling, crackling, and sending each current through the other until the charge had run its course. This whole electricity thing, he would always like highlight that in Wood books. And so he would look for that in other works. When we were looking for Wood in the France books, sometimes there would be things like that, and he would be like, "Oh." So I think that's another thing that he might have grabbed onto, because that's not the only one. There's a lot of it's not unique to this book, but there's a lot of this electricity metaphors used throughout anytime there's a coupling.
He was into thrusting tongues for a while until he read wider in this genre and realized, oh no, there's a lot of tongue thrusting going on here.
Yeah, breast fetishism and tongue twingling are
lashing, thrashing tongues. He likes lashing, thrashing. But I was hoping for at least one sexual experience where they were describing kaleidoscopes. If he had mentioned kaleidoscopes, or if he had mentioned pink clouds, or
and to reinforce. Sorry, Paul.
I was just going to say the other thing that was missing was long tangential flashbacks to the characters, like childhoods, like going back to Rick's very first sexual experience or something like that. That's something that Ed would fall back on when he's running out of plot, and there's none of that in here.
I never knew if he was doing background when Ed Wood did that, or if it was just like, I'm gonna go do a flashback because I gotta write some more text.
Yeah.
Like that.
Well, sometimes he would work in what felt like unfinished short stories or something. He would, and there's one novel where very egregiously a character has a flashback and has a different name in the flashback. So I was like, it took me a second to even realize, oh, this is supposed to be a flashback about this character because the character changed his name. So interrupting the flow of the narrative with flashback scenes, very often extremely tangential to the story, is something that Ed Wood loved to do, and you don't see any of that here. In fact, this book is almost a very, very straight line basically we are with Rick. I don't think we're ever away from him for long, if ever. And it's basically a procedural story, a crime procedural story where we just follow him we follow him out to the ranch, we follow him to the mansion, we follow him to different bars, we follow him to an apartment, and eventually he solves the case. And he has that sort of love-hate relationship with the guy on the police force. How would you pronounce that guy's name? Do you remember well, like, I forgot what the guy's name was, but it was like Caro or Capo or something. But that kind of reminded me of something that you would see in detective novels, where the detective always knows somebody on the police squad, and he's always getting into trouble, and then they're telling him, don't leave town, you're a suspect in this, and blah blah. And so none of that could have been that makes me think like this could have been anybody who was sort of well schooled in genre fiction and didn't really need to be Ed. Ed would tend to, he would branch out in all directions, and then you'd finally work your way back. We were talking about the Watts books. There's one Watts book where basically the whole thing is just the hero and his girlfriend basically are spending a weekend together, and then they are just all that time flashing back to different things in their past.
Mm-hmm.
And 90% of the novel is just all these flashbacks that they're having, and then we keep working our way back to the main story. And of course, nothing like that happens in Wild Nympho. It's just a straight sort of basically a detective story, just with a lawyer. So,
and
it does follow all those
I would
tropes
stress. Sorry,
I was just say it does follow all those tropes, as you mentioned, Joe, from getting knocked out a lot and having a friend slash antagonist on the police force, and having a close relationship to the murder victim or someone adjacent. In this case, it was the brother of his friend, who was the sharpshooter. I should mention who goes to blackmail Cleo with dirty pictures, but his blackmail is just to be with her. Like, he's not trying to get any of her money. For love and money, I think, was another phrase that popped out where I was like, made me scratch my head. But
so what was the ultimate goal in this entire crime spree? Was it to get control of the union, or was it to get Jake's money, or what was the ultimate?
I think he just wanted to be back with Cleo slash.
No, I mean, ultimately at the end of the novel, like once we get the whole solution, I think the one person who ends up taking the fall is the wild boar guy, I think, whose name is like Nicky Boar.
Nicky Boar, yeah.
And I think Nicky Boar eventually ends up being the guy who takes the fall for the whole thing. What was his end game? Was it to get control of the union, or was it to what was the goal there?
That wasn't
I didn't know.
particularly clear to me.
So
I agree.
It was certainly clear to Rick Force. Rick figured it out, and he was real proud of himself for figuring it out. He was like, "Yep, I put all the pieces together." And then I'm going to explain it to you at length. And then I think he spends a whole chapter explaining what the solution to the mystery is. And I still didn't get it. So
I think we're just supposed to be impressed that Rick connected these French words to guide him along the way, right?
I wanted to add that it was Renee, a flamboyant character that spoke French, that was able to translate that. And that was another thing, because there's Renee's and Ed Wood.
Oh yeah, there is
novels.
there is that character on that commercial shoot that I mentioned. There's sort of a gay coded makeup man or something who's working on who's putting. But to Rick's credit, he says, that when the football players complains, do I have to wear all this crap on my face? And then he says, yeah, if you don't want to look like an embalmed corpse. So
Hog and Mule were very Woodyan characters to me, from
Yes.
whether
Well,
they're the grave diggers in Plan 9 or like the unproduced scripts like The Ghoul Goes West. There's like a Lobo and a giant Lobo-esque kind of characters in
well,
that script. And just there's always these pair of morons that are like kind of used for comic effect.
well, if
I
they
what
were to make this, if they were to make this into a movie, there would have been only one choice in my mind to play Bronco, and that would have been Tor. I would have put Tor in the Bronco Zersky role, because he's supposed to be this gigantic, huge guy. I don't know who I would have cast as. I don't know. Did you have any actors in mind for Rick Force? I don't know.
I mean, he would have been the same kind of,
Well, Eddie loved those.
cardboard, guy
Well, Eddie loved
that
those.
had the money, or you know.
Well, Eddie loved those square-jawed man's man type of characters. He liked to put them in to his stories and novels, and Rick would have been another one. If this had been a Wood novel, that would have been very typical of his protagonists. So, um, heck, I could see Greg Walcott playing it. I don't know. Maybe
yeah.
bring Greg back to play this. But I must admit, though, that not too many of the characters emerge as all that interesting to me individually in Wild
Yeah,
Nympho.
yeah, yeah. That is something that is very different from what you're used to with Ed, even like this genre, like a Philip Marlowe style detective story, where even if the plot doesn't make sense, you're leaning on like the style, the way the narrator talks is fun, and then you're leaning on this series of interesting characters that you meet, these individual scenes with these really memorable characters. And even in Ed's books, usually there's a few standout characters that are like more memorable than the book itself. And yeah, this one, I mean, the football guys, I guess, were kind of
I guess
memorable,
so. I
but
guess they're sort of interesting, but
Our
I
villainess,
didn't.
the femme fatale, while she has kind of an interesting backstory, but she herself is not all that interesting. But her boot, I don't know if it was her boudoir, but where she and our hero first couple up, it's dark, and later he finds that the whole room is full of terrariums with snakes in them, and the snake thing is just over the top in this book.
Okay,
Even
that's
the
the
drive
interesting.
to her house is S-shaped, it's just like the snake
Yes.
pit.
See, that scene right there would be perfect for a rewrite to remove Rick and somehow work Kelton the cop being lured into by the femme fatale into that setting, and just his natural nervousness and just that whole vibe that Paul Marco is able to project as Kelton would have been perfect for.
Oh, if they had made a movie of this with Paul Marco as Rick Force, it would have been, I think, one of the great cult classics of all time. Um,
How about Tammy the Python, who
oh yeah.
hops around our hero? It was just that was a very over the top moment in the book.
How about Ed Wood as Jan Missouri? I think that could have been.
I think Ed would
yeah.
would have been uh who the person back at the ranch. What's her name?
Oh, Reba?
Yeah, he would have been Reba.
Yeah, who has that primitive style of lovemaking. So that's a part of, Jake loves to have sex with people who are mourning loved ones. He does that a couple of times in the book. So at least three times, I believe. So um,
It's his
we hear
movie.
about we hear about denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Uh, we don't hear about the fornication step in the grieving process, but apparently that is part of what. Oh, I thought the phoniest moment in the whole freaking book was, Tony gets killed and um, Jake makes such a big deal of it, like, Rick makes such a big deal of it, like, I cried unashamedly. But then I was right on with this case, like, okay, Mr. Sensitive, Mr. Alan Alda here, he was able to shed a single crocodile tear for this secretary that he was screwing.
Oh, well,
And was,
that's just standard for the era with these guys, right? I mean, it's like
yeah.
they will also go from professing their absolute abject love to a woman to then screwing another one moments later. I think the perfect role for Ed, though, we've got twin women here. He could have been both
Oh, yeah.
Tony and Monica Wright.
Oh, wow. Oh, by the way, what is a gunsel? The only time I've ever heard of a gunsel is in, I think, the Maltese Falcon. I think Elisha Cook Jr. is supposed to be a gunsel. Is that just like a thug with a gun that you hire to send out on a job?
That's one. Another meaning is it's actually a synonym for a catamite or a young boy that's forced into
Yes.
homosexuality by an older man. And it also can just be generally used as like a stupid or inexperienced youth.
So the
Thinking
one,
about how whether or not they were using it pejoratively in Maltese Falcon or not, and I would say they were based on Elisha
yes.
Cook's, performance. But anyway.
Well, there's a character who is a gunsel in this. Manny Fry, I believe is his name. He's the one who was actually sent out to kill. He's supposed to kill Rick, but he ends up killing Tony. And I pictured him as being Elisha Cook Jr. So as soon as they described him as a gunsel, I was like, I couldn't get the Elisha Cook character from Maltese Falcon out of my mind. So, um,
It
I
could
mean,
also be somebody who's a patsy, like in this case, right?
yes. Well, I don't know if you guys do that too when you read novels, especially like this. If characters um, remind you of people from movies, like noir movies, if you just picture those actors being those characters. So um, I don't know why. I guess Jake Missouri, who's not really a character in this, I thought of basically the Hoffa biopic where I think it was Jack Nicholson playing Jimmy Hoffa. Did anybody see that movie? There was a whole movie about Jimmy Hoffa just called Hoffa. Um, but um, I could never get a handle on who Rick would have been. So, because I don't think he's that vividly drawn a character. But again, I guess looking a lot like Dick Clark, I would say here. He just looks like he's about to play a Chubby Checker record. And I like that he's wearing a short sleeve dress shirt with a necktie. So he's got that sort of, Mormon going door to door, knocking on people's doors kind of look. I'm sure that drives the women crazy. But
That would be a good twist on the detective genre if a Mormon missionary fell ass backwards into figuring out a case and is riding his bike from house to house and bar to nightclub and stuff, trying to figure out who killed let's say his partner in the mission or whatever. Anyway,
that would be fun. But you know, he's just generic protagonist man. That's all he really is. So
And
yeah,
of
I
course,
don't
if
know.
this is 60s sleaze, it's going to be like, I could sense the urgency beneath his temple garments.
Yes, I would say that even if this book isn't Ed Wood, having it thought of as possibly Ed Wood is maybe the best thing that's happened to this novel in decades, because I can definitely see this book being completely forgotten by history, being completely buried by decades and decades of other media. And the only reason why four people read this book in 2025 is because of Ed Wood. So Matt Ronson, whoever you are, you have Ed Wood to thank for
There's
that.
gonna be a real Matt Ronson, and he's still alive. He's this old dude, and he's like, "Why are they all remaindered? You'll never see a dime."
by the way, I wanted
Not
to
that everyone
say
wasn't paid for their work up front, but anyway.
All.
just real quick. So through a convoluted series of events, in my first copywriting job, I was a Teamster, and as being a Teamster, I got all the Teamster mail, and one of the things I got was annual an announcement about the annual Jimmy Hoffa essay writing contest. I think this was for high school kids, and uh, they would get a little bit of money for college or whatever, like $100 or something. I don't know. Anyway, there was a Jimmy Hoffa essay writing contest for kids, and it makes me wonder if in the alternate universe of this novel, if there's a Jake Missouri essay writing contest for kids.
Yeah, I would hate to think what happens to the losers of that contest. They might wind up what was it, buried in Giant Stadium or something. So
Yes.
where is there are obviously there are urban legends.
The rumor was that he was under the visitors end at Giant Stadium. Yeah.
Because, and I think in this book do the players actually play for the Giants? I think they call them like the New York Professional Football Giants. Yeah. And that's something that I've only ever known New Yorkers to do, is to anybody else in the country would just call them the Giants or the New York Giants.
Well, that goes back to when you had the baseball Giants in New York still.
Right. Oh, yeah. Right. So
they made that distinction.
So whenever you hear somebody say the New York Football Giants, that's something I've only ever heard New Yorkers do. New Yorkers are the only ones who do that. So that's another possibility that Matt Ronson, wherever he was, and then he never wrote another book. I know what happened. He figured I nailed it. I nailed it with Wild Nympho. I'm walking away from the typewriter forever. Like, what am I going to do? Top this? Or
it was so close to real life, he was made to disappear when certain forces read it.
That could have happened. The mob found out, but I would like to think he thought, like, well, what am I going to do? Write Moby Dick Part 2 here? No, this was my War and Peace. This was my Anna Karenina right here. I've said all I need to say. Although I think this book was certainly set up to. I don't know if you would agree that this book was certainly set up to have Rick Force have more adventures. Do you think so? Do you think that there could have been more? I mean, he'll need to have more than 2 clients. So what do you think, Paul? Do you think that there could have been more adventures of Rick Force?
One of the things I did when I couldn't bring up anything by Matt Ronson, I was like, well, maybe if I Google Rick Force, I'll find out there's a bunch of novels about Rick Force, but unfortunately there aren't any. But yes, I think that he could be a recurring character for sure.
Yeah, I think he would have.
Well, as you said, Paul, it rewinds back to the beginning. We end up where we started as far as Rick's concerned.
Rick Force, any good TV he's got a secretary this time. She's Monica, but she looks like Tony because they're twin sisters. And then somebody gets knocked off, and it'll be in another arena. Oh, we lost your audio. Just drop for a second.
Go ahead, Paul.
It could be a recurring device where Rick Force's secretary dies every time, and every time she has another sister that pops up at the end of the novel.
It could be like the drummers in Spinal Tap, like he just keeps going through secretaries. But a possibility just occurred to me. I don't know what the copyright situation on this book is, but anybody out there who wants to write New Adventures of Rick Force,
novel writing contest.
Yeah, it's up to you.
Pad library, you could probably just run free across the landscape and no one's going to care.
Yeah.
It's what's November? They often say it's you write a novel in November.
Well, I did it once. I did NaNoWriMo. So
yeah, I've done that a few times myself.
So yeah.
I actually thought about that when I was reading this book because in the sections where he basically summarizes or catches us up, ostensibly he's catching us up on the mystery and the solution to the mystery. Read as if the author himself had lost track of what was happening and he was spinning his wheels trying to, and the reason why I mentioned that regarding National Novel Writing Month is I feel like I've done that myself. Just spend a bunch of words trying to remind myself what the plot is about, and then,
Oh, well, when I did NaNoWriMo, I was shameless. I was like, you know what this is about? I will tell you what this is about. Here is the thing that this is about. I am about to tell you the thing that I am about to tell you. And I'm like, because you're counting, you're trying to get a word count by every day, um, so if you go to my blog, you can find that novel. If you go to the web version and you look at the bar off to the side, um, you can find a link to the NaNoWriMo novel. If you can get through it, I've never known anybody who's been able to get through it. So I can't get through chapter one of it. So um, that is a
It, it's
challenge.
funny you mentioned about pounding out those words because I've heard other writers mention when they're writing as hacks a lot, just like in this book where there's like one sentence or very short paragraphs
Yeah.
is a way to fill up the page, where it's just like
Yeah.
lots of dialogue that's short. It's like you can be, oh, I can knock out a page that way. And
So, Star Distributors, who did a lot of porn in the late 70s, pornographic novels in the late 70s into the 80s, that their style sheet prescribed basically how many lines per page and how many words per page you should have. And it was a very uh sort of spread out style like that.
But they didn't prescribe which order the lines should be on that page. Apparently,
No, but they did prescribe how many pages you were allowed in between sexual encounters.
oh, wow.
yeah,
So they wanted to keep it,
You know what's funny?
moving.
I seem to remember as a producer, Roger Corman would say things like that to his screenwriters and directors. Like, he would go through a script and say, like, okay, every 10 pages, you don't have to have a sex scene, but you have to have something like have a character have be in something revealing or have something that makes people think that there's a sex scene coming up. You don't have to, but he would say it has to be like every 10 pages here. So go through your screenplay and about every 10 pages, have something at least potentially sexy happening in your movie. So yeah, I would say that Wild Nympho actually moves along at a very good pace and is quite efficient. So that's another point in its favor. So you will not be bored. This book does not waste your time.
so I want to mention a couple other things that made me scratch my head, about whether this could have possibly been Ed Wood. I think we've come to the consensus that it's not, but there's a lot of ellipses.
Yeah,
That's not unique to Ed Wood, but
no.
he did use
Mhm.
them a lot in there here.
He
Um,
only he uses them like when things get hazy. He uses them like when he's going in and out of consciousness. Ed would use them like indiscriminately wherever. Ed would
yeah,
just, So Matt Ronson uses them purposefully. Ed just used them randomly.
I agree. And sometimes, although, yeah, sometimes Ed
On
Wood
the
would use
cover
it
of
to like, oh, go ahead, Paul.
ellipses on the cover of the book
Oh
in
yeah.
the description.
Cleo had one big problem, dot, 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 men, which,
It's funny you guys mention that because I often, when you read blurbs on paperbacks, sometimes it comes across as Ed Wood's writing style. There's lots of ellipses, but there's just like everything's written like a punch, like it's like he's selling it the whole time.
well, on the back cover, it says he had never met a woman like her before, sensual, desirous, provocative. And I'm like, are you freaking kidding? He meets women like this all the time. He meets them wherever he goes. What are you saying? He's never met a woman like that. He meets a woman like that like every 10 or 15 pages in this book, and they're always raring to go. So, maybe that's the problem. The Wild Nympho is not really all that special in the book because, you know, he's got babes on tap basically. He can just basically just turn on the faucet and the babes come out. So, um, yeah, it's Jan Missouri is not, or Anne Missouri at one point. I think they dropped the J from her name. They call her
And
Anne. Um,
Yeah, there was a lot of that throughout the whole book. I wrote down some examples because sometimes Ed Wood did that. I never know if it was the typesetter or Ed Wood, But like to your point earlier, Joe, I forget which book it was, maybe Only House, where it goes to a flashback and the name of the
I think it's Only
character is
House.
changed
Yeah.
altogether. Like he did pull it from another source or something.
I
And that
think it's Only House. Yeah.
yeah. But yeah, there was a lot of that in here. I think it was just typos, but there were a number of those, which makes you stop and be like, wait, Cal and Carl and Jake and Jack, those kept changing.
Oh yeah.
See, the
And
problem is if they took more care to produce this book, they wouldn't be able to get you another one just like it the following week. And
right.
that's what a lot of this was really driven by.
They would have also had to charge 96 cents rather than 95. They would have had to, if they had paid a proofreader, oh my God, imagine that luxury. They might have had to charge 95, 6 cents, 97 cents, 98 cents. Now you're really cutting into people's booze money, when you are hiring all these people to work on the book. So, no, I'm just turning it open to a random page. And he says, and you gentlemen, I take it, are Matt Dillon and Chester, obviously a Gunsmoke reference, or is it Wyatt Earp and Doc Halliday? So um, they can barely keep it together for like a sentence, certainly not a paragraph. So this was just one of those like, go, 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 try and make 95 cents off of somebody, move on to the next one. So it's amazing that it survived to our time, basically. 7 copies of it have survived, We've lost so many great works of literature. I think there's probably certain works of literature that have been lost to time, historical documents that have been lost to time. And there are at least 7, and assembling them would be like assembling all those those stones in the Marvel movie where I don't know if you get all 7 copies together or something.
You know what's
What
funny
would happen?
A portal will open.
Yes, if you get all the Wild Nymphos together. I know people who have done things like this, trying to get as many copies of Jerry Maguire as they can possibly get, or uh, there's this huge collection of the Beatles' White Album where somebody's trying to buy as many possible copies of the Beatles' White Album, or copies of the movie Nacho Chihuahua. There's a guy who's trying to buy up every copy of Nacho Chihuahua on the market. So you're gonna have to pry Wild Nympho out of my cold dead hands. I'll tell you that right now, Mister. I'm not letting go of this baby. There's only 6 more in the world.
I wanted to mention that someone in Greg's family, I think it might have been a grandfather, had a convenience type store or a pagoda type store in a lake where I think he grew up. And you could go there, whatever you needed. Well, I imagined in my head lots of cabins people would go in for their various needs and stuff. But behind the counter, they sold adult novels, and he had a bunch of them, and he sold them a lot of them on eBay. They're not particularly notable, like you wouldn't know the the name of the publisher or the authors, the artwork, and they're all like from the late 60s. The artwork's not very interesting, but apparently those were probably just boxed away when they didn't sell and put in some warehouse section of the store for years, and then Greg had them 30 40 years later. And so that I imagine somewhere there there was a box that someone opened up, and there they
Of the
all
Wild
are.
Nymphos.
Someone stuffed them in a box, sprayed some red spray paint on the top, and boxed it up. And it
I dream of finding boxes like that, full
Yeah.
of assorted, no multiple. Don't want any multiples. Have it just all individuals of missing things.
looking for that. If anybody has any final comments to make about Wild Nympho.
I think if you have multiple copies, a fun thing to do would be if you have those little those sort of giveaway library book kiosks in your neighborhood where they put a copy in of those of this book in one of those, and maybe some kid will find it or something, and it will be like a breakthrough for them. They'll be like, what is this? And then they'll find it, and then it will open up all kinds of new worlds to them. So that's a fun thing to do with Wild Nympho.
That sounds like it would be in a local paper's police beat that somebody
Yeah, it would.
screwed up
Eventually,
the give a
it
book, take a book.
yes, the give. I don't know what you call those little library kiosks, but if the wild nymph, oh, imagine if wild nymphos just started showing up in these all over America. Who's putting the wild nymphos in these kiosks? Um, that could be a new chapter in the Wild Nympho saga. So that would be my recommendation if you come across a whole bunch of these. Um, give them out at if you happen to find like a whole crate of them or something, give them out at Halloween instead of candy. You know, feed their minds instead of rotting their teeth. You know, so Wild Nympho I think could be taught in the schools also. So. And become a lawyer. This encourages you to become a lawyer because look at the
Of
fun that
course.
you have when
It's
you
got
become a
some
lawyer.
fringe benefits for
Oh my God.
certain. All right, well, I want to thank everybody, Joe, Jim, and Paul, for getting together. Thanks, Greg, for
Greg.
giving this to us. It was a fun read. It was fun to talk about. It was fun to bring the summit back together. Maybe there'll be more. We'll see. But anyway, we'll bring this to a close. Thanks for watching the Edwood Summit podcast. Take care, everybody.